The moment I tasted the sauce, I knew something was terribly wrong. 15 years of training under Europe's finest chefs had taught me to detect the subtlest variations in flavor. But this wasn't about culinary precision. This was about survival. I, François Dubois, head chef of the Royal Kitchen at Buckingham Palace, had just discovered that someone had tampered with the sauce diplomate intended for tomorrow's state banquet. The question was, who would dare to compromise a dinner hosting 12 of the world's most powerful leaders? Standing alone in the vast palace kitchen at 3 a.m., surrounded by gleaming copper pots and the gentle hum of industrial refrigerators, I carefully recapped the sauce and placed it back in its designated spot. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of what I'd discovered. The altered sauce contained traces of something I couldn't quite identify, something that shouldn't be there. Protocol dictated that I should immediately alert palace security, but years of working within these gilded walls had taught me that discretion was often more valuable than haste. One wrong move could end my career, or worse, trigger an international incident that would embarrass the crown. I pulled out my personal notebook, the one where I kept my most treasured recipes, and began documenting everything I could remember about the sauce's preparation. Chef Maurice had prepared it under my supervision at 4 p.m. I had tasted it then, perfect, as always. The kitchen had been locked at 11 p.m. after the evening's dinner service. Only 3 people had access to the keys: myself, Maurice, and Sandra, the night supervisor. The security cameras would have caught anyone entering the kitchen. But something told me this wasn't the work of an outsider. The perpetrator knew our routines, understood our protocols, and most importantly, knew exactly which sauce to target. The one that would be served to every single dignitary at tomorrow's banquet. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. A text from Maurice. Chef, need to discuss tomorrow's menu changes. Urgent. Menu changes? At this hour? We had finalized everything weeks ago, down to the last garnish. Every dish had been selected with diplomatic precision, a careful balance of flavors that wouldn't offend any cultural sensitivities, while showcasing British culinary excellence. I texted back, meet me in the garden, 10 minutes. The palace gardens at night were a different world entirely. Moonlight silvered the carefully manicured hedges, and fountains whispered secrets in the darkness. I chose this spot for its privacy, and because it was one of the few places I knew wasn't under constant surveillance. Maurice emerged from the shadows, his chef's whites almost ghostly in the moonlight. Something was off about his usually impeccable appearance. His collar was askew, and his hands kept fidgeting with his phone. Chef, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I've received instructions about tomorrow's menu. We need to make some adjustments. From whom? I kept my voice steady, though my heart was racing. I can't say, but it's important, critical even. He glanced around nervously. The sauce diplomate, it needs to stay exactly as it is now. No more tasting, no adjustments. Promise me you'll leave it alone. In that moment, I understood 2 things with perfect clarity. Maurice was involved in whatever was happening, and he had no idea I'd already discovered the tampering. I forced myself to nod slowly, as if considering his request. Of course, I said carefully. The sauce is perfect as it is. Relief flooded his features, but it was short-lived. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and Maurice nearly jumped out of his skin. I should go. Remember what I said, chef. Please. I watched him hurry away, his footsteps fading into the night. The garden's peaceful atmosphere now felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of conspiracy. I pulled out my phone and opened my contacts, scrolling to a number I'd hoped I'd never have to use. 3 years ago, Lady Elizabeth, the Queen's private secretary, had given me this number with explicit instructions. Use this only if you encounter something that could threaten the crown, but be absolutely certain before you do. Was I certain? The evidence was circumstantial at best. A slightly off taste in a sauce, a suspicious midnight meeting, a nervous sous chef. But my instincts were screaming that this was exactly the sort of situation Lady Elizabeth had warned me about. Before I could second-guess myself, I typed out a message. The diplomatic sauce has been compromised. Maurice involved. Time sensitive. Francois. The response came almost immediately. Stay where you are. Within minutes, I heard the soft crunch of gravel. Lady Elizabeth emerged from the darkness, her elegant figure wrapped in a dark coat. She wasn't alone. Behind her walked a man I'd never seen before, though his bearing screamed, "Security services." "Tell me everything," she said without preamble. "And Francois? If you're wrong about this, it will be the end of your career. If you're right..." She left the sentence hanging. I took a deep breath and began to explain, watching their faces grow increasingly grave as I detailed my discoveries. When I finished, Lady Elizabeth exchanged a look with her companion. "We'll need to test the sauce," the man said, speaking for the first time. His accent was pure Oxford, but there was steel beneath the polish. "But we can't let anyone know we're investigating. The banquet must proceed as planned, for now." "And Maurice?" I asked. "Leave him to us," Lady Elizabeth said. "For now, return to your duties as if nothing has happened. But Francois?" She fixed me with an intense stare. "Watch everything, and trust no one." As I walked back to my quarters, my mind raced with questions. Who was really behind this? What was in that sauce? And most importantly, what would happen at tomorrow's banquet? The palace windows glowed softly in the night, each light representing someone awake and working in the vast machine that kept the monarchy running. Somewhere in those rooms, decisions were being made, plans set in motion. And I, a simple chef, had somehow stumbled into the center of it all. I reached my room and locked the door, but sleep felt impossible. Instead, I sat at my small desk and began to write everything down. Every detail, every observation, every suspicion. If something happened to me, someone would need to know the truth. The truth. I almost laughed at the word. In my 15 years at the palace, I'd learned that truth was as carefully crafted as any of my dishes. Layer upon layer of flavors, some obvious, others subtle, all combining to create something that might not be what it first appeared to be. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. But as I sat there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just taken the first bite of a meal that would change my life forever. Dawn arrived with the usual choreographed chaos of a palace kitchen preparing for a state banquet. As my team bustled around me, I maintained a facade of normalcy, barking orders and tasting dishes with my usual precision. But my eyes kept drifting to the walk-in refrigerator, where the compromised sauce diplomat waited. Maurice arrived precisely on time, his uniform pristine as if our midnight meeting had never happened. If I hadn't witnessed his nervous fidgeting in the garden hours before, I would have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. "The Dover soul needs attention, Maurice," I called out, watching his reaction carefully. "The sauce seems off." His shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "I'll handle it personally, chef." As he moved toward the fish station, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small red mark on his wrist, just visible beneath his sleeve. It looked like a burn, but not the kind typically earned in a kitchen. This was a perfect circle, like a brand. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a message from Lady Elizabeth. "Testing complete. Meet in the Rose Room, now." "Sandra, take over," I announced. "I have a meeting with the event coordinator." The Rose Room was actually a small security office disguised as a storage space for the palace's extensive collection of dried flowers. Lady Elizabeth waited inside with the same man from last night, and a new face. A woman in a lab coat who looked like she hadn't slept. "The sauce was indeed tampered with," the woman began without preamble. "We found traces of a compound that, when heated, releases a specific chemical signature. Harmless to consume, but, I prompted. But detectable by extremely sensitive equipment, the kind used in high-level security screening." The man from last night stepped forward. "Someone wants to trigger every security sensor at this banquet. The chaos would be significant." My mind raced through the implications. 12 world leaders, their security details, the press. A diversion? Precisely. Lady Elizabeth's voice was tight. "While all attention is focused on a potential chemical threat, Something else entirely could be happening elsewhere in the palace. "We need you to prepare a new batch of sauce," the man said. "Identical in every way, except clean. But here's the crucial part. No one can know we've switched them." "Maurice will know," I said. "He's watching the sauce like a hawk." "Leave Morris to us," the woman in the lab coat replied. "We've arranged for him to be called away for a security check regarding his work visa. Standard procedure, nothing suspicious." I nodded, but something was nagging at me. "There's more to this than just Maurice. He's not clever enough to orchestrate something this sophisticated. Last night, he mentioned receiving instructions." "We know." Lady Elizabeth's expression darkened. "We've been tracking a group that's been trying to infiltrate palace staff for months. They call themselves the Crimson Circle." The red mark on Maurice's wrist suddenly made horrible sense. "How deep does this go?" I asked. "That's what we need to find out." Lady Elizabeth handed me a small device that looked like a normal kitchen thermometer. "This will allow you to communicate with us directly. Keep it with you at all times." Back in the kitchen, I found Maurice still absent and seized my chance. With practiced efficiency, I prepared a new batch of sauce diplomate, identical to the original recipe. Years of muscle memory took over. Reduce the fish fumette, mount with cold butter, finish with cream and a touch of lemon. Perfect. As I worked, my mind wandered to the last time the palace had faced a serious security breach. It was before my time, but the story was legendary among long-serving staff. In 1982, a man had broken into the Queen's bedroom, spending 10 minutes talking to her before security arrived. The incident had led to a complete overhaul of palace security protocols. But this was different. This was an inside job, executed with patience and precision. Someone had taken the time to place their people in key positions, to learn our routines, to understand exactly how to exploit the complex machinery of a state banquet. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed it. A slight movement in my peripheral vision. Sandra was standing by the spice rack, her phone held at an odd angle. Was she photographing my sauce preparation? The thermometer in my pocket suddenly felt very heavy. Before I could process this new development, Morris returned, looking shaken. His earlier nervousness had evolved into full-blown fear. He kept touching his wrist where the burn mark was, a gesture that now carried new significance. "Everything all right?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. "Fine," he replied too quickly. "Just a paperwork issue." His eyes darted to the sauce I was finishing. "Is that the sauce diplomate?" "Yes. I noticed the other batch had separated slightly. Couldn't risk serving it at the banquet." I watched his face carefully. "I disposed of the old batch." The color drained from his face. "You disposed of it? Is that a problem?" For a moment, I thought he might faint. Then his professional mask slipped back into place. "No, of course not, Chef. Whatever you think is best." He turned away, but not before I saw him pull out his phone with trembling hands. Whoever was pulling his strings would not be happy about this development. The next few hours passed in a blur of final preparations. I watched my staff like a hawk, noting every unusual movement, every whispered conversation. Sandra took 3 more phone calls in the storage area. 2 servers I didn't recognize tried to enter the kitchen, but were turned away by security. The air grew thick with more than just cooking steam. Tension, fear, and secrets seemed to simmer in every pot. At 4 p.m., Lady Elizabeth appeared for the customary final tasting. As she sampled each dish, her eyes met mine, conveying a silent message. "Be ready." "The sauce is perfect," she announced clearly, her voice carrying across the kitchen. "Her Majesty will be pleased." I noticed Maurice's slight flinch at her words, saw Sandra's hand tighten around her phone. They were running out of time to fix their failed plan, and desperate people make mistakes. As the kitchen staff began plating the first course, I received another text. "Second team in position. Maintain normal service. Watch for the signal." I looked around my kitchen, my domain, my responsibility. Somewhere in this room, perhaps at this very moment, the next move in this dangerous game was being planned. The banquet would begin in less than 2 hours, and with it, whatever endgame the Crimson Circle had designed. The weight of the thermometer in my pocket reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. But as I caught Sandra taking yet another furtive photo and saw Maurice's hand shake as he garnished a plate, I couldn't help but wonder, how many more conspirators were hidden among my trusted staff? And what would happen when the true purpose of this elaborate plot was finally revealed? The clock struck 5, and the first guests began to arrive upstairs. In 90 minutes, 12 world leaders would sit down to dine, unaware that their evening's menu included a generous portion of treachery. At precisely 6:30 p.m., the first course left my kitchen. I watched each plate with hawk-like intensity, noting every hand that touched them, every server who carried them through the grand double doors. The modified thermometer in my pocket vibrated once, a signal that the security team was in position. The sauce diplomate would accompany the fish course, scheduled for 7:15 p.m. That gave me 45 minutes to uncover whatever secondary plot was unfolding in my kitchen. I could feel time slipping away like melting ice. "Chef," Sandra approached, her face a mask of concern. "There's a problem with the wine service. They need you in the cellar." The wine cellar. The perfect place for an ambush. Isolated, soundproof, with limited camera coverage. I'd worked in this palace long enough to recognize a trap. "Send Maurice," I replied, watching her reaction. "I need to supervise the main course preparation." "Maurice is checking the vegetarian alternatives," she said smoothly. Too smoothly. "It has to be you, chef. The sommelier specifically asked for you." I reached for the thermometer, preparing to signal for help, when a commotion erupted at the kitchen entrance. One of the new servers, the ones I hadn't recognized earlier, had dropped a tray of appetizers. As my staff rushed to clean up the mess, I noticed something odd. Sandra didn't move to help. Instead, she was typing rapidly on her phone. The thermometer vibrated twice, urgent. I pulled it out, pretending to check a sauce temperature, and saw the message scrolling across its tiny display. "Cellar clear. Go now. Play along." "Fine," I snapped at Sandra, maintaining my reluctant facade. "But this had better be quick." The wine cellar's stone stairs seemed to descend into darkness itself. Sandra followed close behind me, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. At the bottom, instead of the sommelier, I found Lady Elizabeth and her security team. Before Sandra could react, 2 agents seized her arms. She didn't resist. Instead, she smiled. "Right on time," she said, but she wasn't talking to us. Suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the palace. Not the fire alarms. These were different, more urgent. Security breach alarms. "What have you done?" Lady Elizabeth demanded. "Created a distraction," Sandra replied calmly. "While everyone's looking down here, they're not looking up there." She nodded toward the ceiling. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The sauce was never the real threat, was it? Finally, someone asks the right question. Sandra's smile widened. "The sauce, the cellar, this arrest, it's all theater. The real show is about to begin upstairs." Lady Elizabeth grabbed her radio, but Sandra's laugh stopped her. "Don't bother. Communications are already jammed, part of the plan." The thermometer in my pocket went dead. "Chef," Lady Elizabeth's voice was steel. "Get back to your kitchen, now." I took the stairs 2 at a time, my mind racing. If the sauce wasn't the real threat, what was? And why go through such an elaborate ruse with Maurice and the tampering? The kitchen was in chaos when I returned. The security alarms had everyone on edge, and Maurice was nowhere to be seen. The fish course was due to leave in 10 minutes, but that seemed irrelevant now. Then I saw it. The vegetarian alternatives Maurice was supposedly checking. We had prepared 4 special meals for guests with dietary restrictions. But there were 5 plates on the station. I approached the plates slowly, professionally, as if doing a routine check. Each plate was perfectly arranged, identical in presentation. But the 5th plate had something extra. A small, almost invisible device tucked beneath the garnish. My first instinct was to alert security, but with communications jammed, I had no way to reach them. The dinner service was proceeding despite the alarms. Protocol dictated that unless there was an immediate visible threat, the banquet must continue to avoid diplomatic embarrassment. I had minutes to make a decision. Remove the device and risk triggering it? Leave it and risk something worse? As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, I heard Maurice's voice behind me. "Don't touch it, chef." I turned to find him holding a small remote control, his hands steady now, all traces of nervousness gone. The frightened sous chef had vanished, replaced by someone altogether more dangerous. "You played your part perfectly," he said. "The concerned mentor, the vigilant chef. You gave us exactly the cover we needed to get everything in place." "What is it?" I asked, nodding toward the device. "Insurance," he replied, "in case our demands aren't met. The Crimson Circle believes in leverage, you see. In about 2 minutes, that plate will be served to one of the most powerful people in this room. They'll have a choice, meet our demands or—" He left the threat hanging, but his meaning was clear. "Why tell me this?" "Because you have a choice too." He held out a small red pin, the mark of the Crimson Circle. "Join us. You've seen how vulnerable they are, how easily their security can be breached. Help us reshape the world." Time seemed to slow down. I looked at the pin, then at the plates waiting to be served. In the distance, I could hear the dinner service continuing despite the alarms, the carefully choreographed dance of servers and stewards proceeding as if nothing was wrong. I thought about my 15 years in this kitchen, about the trust placed in me, about the responsibility that came with my position. I thought about Lady Elizabeth's words from the night before. Watch everything. Trust no one. Then I thought about something else, something I'd learned in my first year of culinary school. The best way to deal with a grease fire isn't to confront it directly, but to smother it. "You're right," I said, reaching for the pin. "I want to see how this ends." Maurice's triumphant smile lasted exactly 2 seconds, the time it took me to grab the nearest fire extinguisher and empty it into the air above us. The kitchen's fire suppression system activated instantly, filling the room with fire-suppressing foam. In the chaos that followed, I grabbed the plate with the device and slammed it into the nearest sink, covering it with a heavy pot. Maurice lunged for me but slipped on the foam-covered floor. The remote control flew from his hand, skittering across the tiles. I dove for it, my fingers closing around the device just as the kitchen doors burst open. Armed security officers flooded the room, followed by Lady Elizabeth. Sandra's distraction had failed, or perhaps it had never been meant to succeed. The real plot had been here all along, in my kitchen, waiting to be served on a silver plate. As Morris was led away in handcuffs, Lady Elizabeth approached me. "Well done," she said quietly, though I could have done without the foam. I looked around at my ruined kitchen, the scattered plates, the mess that would take days to clean. "I suppose dinner is canceled?" "On the contrary," she smiled. "The show must go on. I hope you have a backup plan for the main course?" I did, of course. A chef always has a plan B. But as I began directing my shaken staff to prepare the alternate menu, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Maurice and Sandra were just 2 members of the Crimson Circle. How many more were out there, waiting for their moment? The thermometer in my pocket buzzed back to life with a new message. Phase 1 complete. Remain vigilant. Phase 1. The words sent a chill down my spine despite the kitchen's heat. What else did the Crimson Circle have planned? And more importantly, would I be ready for it? The next 24 hours passed in a blur of police interviews and security debriefings. I recounted every detail, from the first taste of the tampered sauce to the moment I emptied the fire extinguisher. But something kept nagging at me, a detail I couldn't quite place, like an ingredient missing from a familiar recipe. I was finally allowed to return to my kitchen late the following evening. The foam had been cleaned up, but something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with unspoken tensions. Half my staff had been detained for questioning, and those who remained worked in uncomfortable silence, casting suspicious glances at one another. As I began my routine kitchen inspection, my replacement thermometer, the old one had been taken as evidence, vibrated with a message. "Check your private office. Urgent." My office was barely more than a closet, a desk, a filing cabinet, and walls lined with cookbooks. But as soon as I entered, I noticed something was wrong. The spine of my oldest cookbook, a leather-bound volume of French classics, was slightly askew. Inside, I found a note written in a hand I recognized, Lady Elizabeth's distinctive script. The device was a decoy. Real target still unknown. Trust no one knew. No one knew. The words triggered that nagging memory I couldn't place. During the chaos yesterday, I'd seen someone I didn't recognize entering the palace's east wing. Someone wearing kitchen whites but moving with military precision. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the staff roster. 3 new names had been added in the past week. 2 commis chefs and a pastry assistant, all with impeccable references, all cleared by security. The thermometer vibrated again. East wing compromised. Investigation needed. Maintain cover. I needed a reason to visit the East Wing, something that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Then I remembered. The palace's secondary kitchen was there, used primarily for informal family meals. As head chef, I had every right to inspect it. Sandra and Maurice were part of a larger plan, I muttered to myself as I walked the ornate corridors. The question is, what was the banquet really covering up? The secondary kitchen was dark when I arrived, but I could smell something recent, a distinct aroma of baked pastry and something else, something chemical. I flipped on the lights and began my inspection. Everything looked normal at first glance. Clean counters, organized equipment, properly stored ingredients. But then I noticed the slight scuff marks on the floor leading to the dry storage room. The door was locked, unusual for this time of day. I used my master key, pushing it open slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. What I found made my heart stop. The storage room had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. Complex chemical equipment lined makeshift shelves, and a laptop hummed quietly in the corner. On a central table, dozens of small vials contained a clear liquid. The thermometer buzzed. In position. Evidence? I reached for my phone to take pictures, but a voice behind me froze my blood. I wouldn't do that, chef. I turned to find James, one of the new commis chefs, pointing something at me that definitely wasn't a kitchen knife. The pastries, I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. You've been using the baking schedule as cover for whatever this is. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Very good. The perfect cover, really. Who questions the constant use of ovens in a kitchen? The regular deliveries of chemicals that could be baking supplies? The strange smells? What is all this? Insurance, he replied, using the same word Maurice had. But unlike yesterday's amateur theatrics, this is the real thing. The Crimson Circle doesn't just want to make demands. We want to fundamentally change the power structure of this country. By poisoning the royal family, I guessed, noting the proximity to their private dining rooms. Not poison, he corrected. Something far more elegant. These compounds don't harm, they reveal. Imagine truth serum, but more specific. Targeted to unlock very particular memories, very specific secrets. I thought about the implications. The royal family had access to state secrets going back generations. If they were somehow compelled to reveal them, why tell me this? Because in about 30 seconds it won't matter. He gestured with his weapon. The compound is heat activated. Right now, every oven in this kitchen is releasing a carefully calibrated dose into the ventilation system. The east wing will be saturated within minutes. As if on cue, I heard the distant sound of alarms, different from yesterday's security breach alerts. These were environmental alarms, designed to detect atmospheric contamination. You'll never get away with this, I said, playing for time. The alarms will trigger an evacuation. That's exactly what we're counting on, he smiled. Emergency protocols will route everyone to the secure areas, including the royal family. And guess where the secure area's ventilation system draws its air from? My eyes widened as I understood. The secondary kitchen's ventilation system connected directly to the palace's secure areas. A design flaw that had never seemed important until now. But James had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I was alone. The temperature in the room had been slowly rising as we talked, not from the ovens, but from the dozens of hidden security officers in heat-shielded gear who had been waiting for my signal. Now! I shouted, dropping to the floor. The room erupted in chaos. James fired his weapon, but the shot went wide as multiple officers tackled him. Someone pulled me to safety as a specialized team rushed in to secure the chemical equipment. Well done, Francois. Lady Elizabeth emerged from the shadows, wearing a protective suit. Though I must say, your timing could have been better. I was rather looking forward to afternoon tea. The East Wing? I asked. Being evacuated as we speak, through alternate routes. The ventilation system was shut down the moment you confirmed our suspicions about the ovens. I looked at the chemical setup, now being carefully documented by forensics teams. The Crimson Circle is larger than we thought, she finished. This was sophisticated. State-level sophisticated. Someone with considerable resources is backing them. And they chose my kitchen as their way in. I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. They chose your kitchen because it was the perfect cover, she corrected. But they didn't count on having a chef who notices when things don't smell quite right. The thermometer buzzed one final time. Phase 2 complete, but stay alert. As I watched James being led away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but wonder, how many more phases were there? And more importantly, how many more members of the Crimson Circle were still out there, waiting to make their next move? The next few days passed in a whirlwind of interrogations, security briefings, and frantic kitchen reorganization. Every member of my staff was subjected to rigorous background checks, and I found myself second-guessing every interaction, every glance, every whispered conversation. The palace hummed with tension. Extra security patrols roamed the corridors, and even the most mundane daily routines were scrutinized for potential vulnerabilities. The weight of unspoken suspicions hung heavy in the air, like the lingering aroma of a burnt dish. 5 days after the incident in the East Wing, I was summoned to a meeting in a part of the palace I'd never visited before. Lady Elizabeth led me through a maze of corridors, finally stopping before an unmarked door. "What you're about to see is classified at the highest level," she said, her voice low. "Are you prepared for that level of responsibility, Francois?" I thought about everything that had happened. The tampered sauce, the fake bomb threat, the chemical lab in my kitchen. I thought about the trust placed in me, not just as a chef, but as a protector of the crown in my own unique way. "I am," I replied. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the opulent palace corridors. Stark white walls were covered in screens displaying news feeds, security camera footage, and complex data analyses. A group of people in suits looked up as we entered, their expressions grim. "Francois," Lady Elizabeth began, "meet the Shadow Kitchen." "Shadow Kitchen?" I echoed, confused. A tall man with graying temples stepped forward. "Think of us as the chefs of information, Mr. Dubois. We gather intelligence, analyze patterns, and try to predict where the next threat will come from. And right now, all our ingredients point to something big on the horizon." "The Crimson Circle isn't just an isolated group of extremists," Lady Elizabeth explained. "They're a symptom of a larger movement, one that seeks to undermine not just the monarchy, but the entire system of government." The screens around us came to life, displaying a web of connections, financial transactions, communication logs, travel records. At the center of it all was a symbol I recognized, the red circle Morris had worn on his wrist. "We believe the attacks on the palace were just a test," the gray-haired man continued, "a way to probe our defenses and sow seeds of doubt. The real attack is yet to come." "But what does this have to do with me?" I asked. "I'm a chef, not a spy." Lady Elizabeth smiled sadly. "You're more than a chef, Francois. You're a gatekeeper. Every morsel of food that passes through the palace goes through your kitchen. You have access and insights that even our top agents don't." "We need your help," another analyst chimed in. "Your unique perspective might spot patterns we've missed." For the next few hours, I was immersed in a world far removed from the comforting rhythms of my kitchen. I pored over reports, studied surveillance footage, and listened to intercepted communications. It was overwhelming, like trying to create a 10-course meal with unfamiliar ingredients and no recipe. But slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Just as I could detect the subtle interplay of flavors in a complex dish, I started to sense the underlying currents in this sea of data. "There," I said, pointing to a series of seemingly unrelated events. "These shipments of specialty foods, the sudden changes in certain diplomats' dietary requests, the unusual movements of specific catering companies. They're setting up for something big." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. "The state dinner," Lady Elizabeth breathed. "Next month, for the President of France." It's the perfect target, I realized. Dozens of world leaders, extensive media coverage. And an opportunity to strike at the heart of both British and French leadership, the gray-haired man finished. The next few hours were a flurry of activity, as the team worked to confirm my suspicions and develop countermeasures. I found myself drawing up plans for enhanced food security protocols, designing new kitchen layouts to eliminate blind spots, and creating a system for vetting every ingredient that would enter the palace. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the room's narrow windows, Lady Elizabeth pulled me aside. "You've done remarkable work, Francois," she said, "but I'm afraid we need to ask even more of you." "What do you mean?" "We need you to play a dangerous game. To catch the Crimson Circle, we need to let them think they've succeeded in infiltrating your kitchen again." My stomach churned at the thought. "You want me to bring in someone I know is working for them?" She nodded solemnly. "It's the only way to trace their entire network, but it means putting you at the center of an extremely delicate and dangerous operation." I thought about my team, about the trust they placed in me every day. I thought about the palace staff, the diplomats, the royal family, all of whom relied on the safety and security of the food I prepared. Then I thought about the Crimson Circle, about their willingness to use my kitchen, my domain, as a weapon. Anger flared in my chest, hot as a furnace. "What do you need me to do?" The next week was a careful dance of deception. A new sous chef was hired, Margot, a talented young woman with impeccable credentials. Credentials that I knew were as fake as the truffles at a discount supermarket. I watched her like a hawk, noting every unusual question, every lingering glance at secure areas. I fed her carefully curated information, always under the guise of normal kitchen operations. All the while, I worked with the shadow kitchen to lay our trap. Every dish for the state dinner was designed not just for flavor, but for security. Hidden markers in the sauces would allow us to trace any tampering. The table settings themselves contained undetectable sensors. As the day of the dinner approached, the tension in the kitchen reached a fever pitch. I could see the strain on Margot's face, the barely concealed anxiety as she realized time was running out for whatever she had planned. The night before the dinner, I accidentally left her alone in my office for a few minutes. When I returned, I pretended not to notice that she had accessed my computer. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I received one final message on my secure thermometer. "Endgame tomorrow. Trust your instincts." I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In less than 24 hours, I would be serving a meal that could change the course of history, for better or for worse. The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any toque I'd ever worn. As the first light of dawn crept through my window, I rose and donned my chef's whites. Whatever happened today, I would face it as I had faced every challenge in my career, with skill, with courage, and with the unwavering commitment to create something extraordinary. The stage was set. The ingredients were prepared. Now it was time to cook. The morning of the state dinner dawned bright and clear, a deceptive calm before the storm I knew was coming. My kitchen was a hive of controlled chaos, each member of my team moving with precision born from years of practice. And in the midst of it all was Margot, her eyes darting nervously as she prepared the amuse-bouches. I'd positioned her there deliberately. The tiny one-bite starters were the perfect vehicle for whatever the Crimson Circle had planned. Small enough to avoid detection, served to every guest simultaneously, and consumed quickly without much scrutiny. "Margot," I called out, keeping my voice steady. "I need you to handle the final plating of the amuse-bouche. It's a crucial task. I'm trusting you with it." I saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes, quickly masked by a professional nod. "Of course, chef. I won't let you down." As she turned back to her station, I caught Lady Elizabeth's eye across the room. She was disguised as a kitchen porter, blending seamlessly with the staff. She gave me an almost imperceptible nod. The trap was set. The hours ticked by, each minute feeling like an eternity. I tasted every sauce, inspected every garnish, all while keeping one eye on Margot. She was good, I had to admit. If I hadn't known what to look for, I would never have noticed the way she slipped a small vial from her sleeve, the liquid within clear and odorless as it was distributed among the delicate canapes. At precisely 7 p.m., the dinner began. World leaders and dignitaries filed into the grand dining room, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the kitchen doors. The amuse-bouches went out, each tiny morsel a potential harbinger of disaster. I watched the CCTV feed from the dining room, my heart pounding. The guests raised the canapés to their lips, and I held my breath. Nothing happened. No sudden collapses, no startled exclamations. The dinner continued smoothly into the first course. Confusion and doubt clouded my mind. Had we been wrong? Was Margot innocent after all? Or was this something even more insidious than we'd imagined? I turned to confront her, but she was gone. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. If the amuse-bouches weren't the vector for the attack, what was? Francois. Lady Elizabeth's urgent whisper cut through my panic. The dessert. Check the dessert. I raced to the pastry station, my mind whirling. The dessert, of course. A complex chocolate sculpture prepared in advance, with multiple components. The perfect hiding place for whatever the Crimson Circle had planned. As I reached the cooler where the desserts were stored, I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible mist emanating from the chocolate shells. The sculptures weren't just desserts. They were delivery devices for an aerosolized compound. "Stop the service!" I shouted, my voice carrying over the kitchen din. "Lock down the desserts!" Everything happened at once. Security flooded the kitchen, sealing off the contaminated area. Margot, caught trying to slip out a side entrance, was quickly apprehended. And in the dining room, the unsuspecting guests continued their meal, oblivious to the crisis we'd just averted. As the situation was contained, Lady Elizabeth pulled me aside, her face grim. "Well done, Francois. But I'm afraid this isn't over. The Crimson Circle wouldn't risk everything on a single attack. There's something else coming." Her words were prophetic. Within minutes, reports started flooding in from across London. Power outages, communications blackouts, and chaos in the financial district. The attack on the palace was just a diversion. The real target was the city itself. They're trying to destabilize the entire country, I realized, the scope of the plot finally becoming clear. Lady Elizabeth nodded grimly. "And they're using the confusion to make their final move. We've just received intelligence that a team is en route to extract several key members of Parliament who are secretly working for the Crimson Circle. If they succeed, it could bring down the government." I looked around my kitchen, at the half-prepared meals and the now useless desserts. "What can I do? I'm just a chef." She fixed me with a steely gaze. "You're not just a chef, Francois. You're the person who saw the pattern when no one else could. We need your skills now more than ever." And so, in the most surreal moment of my life, I found myself in the palace's high-tech command center, surrounded by military strategists and intelligence officers. But instead of battle plans, I was looking at a map of London's streets, restaurant supply routes, and catering schedules. "There," I said, pointing to a seemingly random pattern of food deliveries. "That's not normal. Those restaurants are receiving supplies they don't typically order, and the timing is too perfect." "It's a supply line," one of the analysts breathed. "They're using food deliveries to move personnel and equipment across the city without raising suspicion." With this revelation, the security forces were able to intercept the Crimson Circle's teams before they could reach their targets. One by one, the conspirators were apprehended, their carefully laid plans crumbling like an overcooked soufflé. As dawn broke over London, the immediate crisis had passed. The city was battered but unbroken, the government shaken but intact. And I found myself standing in my kitchen once again, surveying the aftermath of a battle fought not with weapons, but with wit, wisdom, and a chef's intuition. Lady Elizabeth joined me, looking as exhausted as I felt. "You've done your country a great service, Francois. One that can never be publicly acknowledged, I'm afraid." I nodded, understanding the need for secrecy. "What happens now?" "We rebuild. We learn from this, and we remain vigilant." She paused, a small smile playing at her lips. "And you, my dear chef, have a breakfast to prepare. I believe His Majesty has requested your famous omelette." As she left, I turned to my stove. The familiar act of cracking eggs and whisking them smooth, bringing a sense of normalcy to the chaos of the past few days. The weight of what had transpired and what had nearly happened pressed heavily on my mind. I realized then that my role as head chef was far more than I had ever imagined. In a world of shadowy threats and hidden dangers, the simple act of preparing food with care and attention was its own form of protection, its own quiet defiance against those who would sow chaos and fear. As I slid the perfectly cooked omelet onto a warmed plate, I made a silent vow. I would continue to serve, not just meals, but as a guardian in my own unique way. Every dish that left my kitchen would be a testament to the resilience of the society we fought to protect. The palace was stirring to life around me, staff resuming their duties as if the events of the night had been nothing but a bad dream. But I knew better. I had glimpsed behind the curtain, seen the delicate balance that kept our world turning. And so, as I sent out the breakfast trays, each one prepared with the utmost care and scrutiny, I allowed myself a small smile. Let the Crimson Circle and others like them plot and scheme. They would never understand the power of a simple meal, prepared with skill and served with pride. In my kitchen, in my domain, I would stand guard, one carefully crafted dish at a time.